Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the isolated forests and backroads of the Appalachian Mountains, where some of the most terrifying encounters aren't with animals, they're with people. These are true Appalachia feral people horror stories, tales that prove sometimes the scariest thing in the woods is human. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Now, let's step into the shadows of Appalachia. I finished my last latte at 11:35, the steam from the cup fogging the glass just enough to make it feel like a small, warm bubble against the bitter January air outside. The diner was closed, lights dimmed, a little bell jangling as I pulled the door behind me, leaving the scent of burnt coffee grounds and cleaning solution in the air. I liked this part of the night. The quiet, the emptiness, the way the world seemed to pause for a moment while I climbed into my car. My old Subaru coughed to life, the heater wheezing a bit before steadying, and I tucked my scarf around my neck, fingers brushing against the cracked leather of the wheel. The road ahead twisted up into the Blue Ridge, miles of dark curves pressed close by dense woods and snow-capped ridges reflecting cold moonlight. I always drove slow here, careful, and I liked that. Careful meant I could see everything. Careful meant I was safe, or at least as safe as anyone could be in the mountains at night. By 11:50, I was finally on the curvy stretch near mile marker 165, headlights illuminating the snow in narrow cones, everything else swallowed by shadow. The heater barely fought the chill pressing through the door seals, and I tucked my knees closer, scarf rising to cover my ears. I liked watching frost form on the edges of the windshield in these cold nights, delicate patterns that melted slightly from the heater's warmth. My eyes traced the lines absently, finding shapes I could call animals or faces if I squinted, just enough to make the time pass. I played a quiet game with myself, noticing every shift in the woods, every subtle sound, the crunch of frozen branches under a squirrel's feet, the distant creak of a tree limb swaying in wind. Nothing ever surprised me here. Nothing ever went wrong. That's what I liked about it. By midnight, something caught the corner of my eye on the passenger window, a faint glimmer I chalked up to frost catching moonlight. I reached over, wiped at it with my sleeve, and froze. The frost had formed the shape of a hand, fingers splayed, pressed flat against the glass from the inside. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and muttered, "Okay, just frost. Just patterns." But the pattern hadn't been there before. The shape lingered even as I wiped again, larger now, the fingers curling slightly, and a cold draft pressed across my shoulder as though something had moved behind me. My stomach dropped, hands tightening on the wheel, and I told myself I was overreacting. The night was long, the shift tiring, and I had barely eaten. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the heater pushing condensation weird. Yeah, that's what it had to be. By 12:10, I noticed streaks across the dash. Faint smears that looked like fingers dragged across the surface, wiping from left to right. Small enough to be human, but impossible from where I sat. I paused the car, pressing my palms flat to the wheel, breath fogging inside the cab, trying to convince myself I had left something on the dash that had melted from my coffee cup. But the smears were deeper than condensation, colder, wet in a way that made my fingers sting. My gaze darted to the passenger seat. Empty. I whispered to the night, "It's nothing, nothing at all." But the frost on the window had reappeared, taller now, the fingers pressing outward as if someone, or something, was pushing against the glass. I could feel the cold spreading into my clothes, chilling my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to drive faster, leave this stretch, Forget it ever happened. By 12:30, I pulled into the overlook pullout, engine still running, heater blasting, and pressed my hand to the frost again. This time I saw faint impressions on the seat beside me, subtle dips in the fabric, as though someone had shifted just moments ago, gone, but left a weight in the air. My breath hitched, fogging the glass in thick clouds, and I caught the smell of something faintly metallic. Blood? Rust? I couldn't tell, only that it made my stomach lurch and my hands tremble. I shook my head, muttered, "You're imagining things," and wiped the frost, forcing myself to laugh, quiet and shaky. The night was long. Exhaustion made patterns. Sleep deprivation made shapes move. Just a coincidence. Had to be. By 12:45, I felt my phone vibrate against the seat, a notification lighting the screen with a flash of blue. I glanced down and froze. The camera app had opened by itself, showing a figure sitting beside me in the passenger seat, head turned away, shoulders slumped, features indistinct but undeniably present. I pressed the power button, tried to dismiss it, checked my lap. Nothing. Just my phone. Battery still healthy. Charger in the console. Heart pounding, stomach twisting, breath catching. Maybe someone had pulled a prank. Maybe it was a reflection of trees and frost and my tired brain. Maybe. But the image stayed in my mind. Haunting, impossible to rationalize. By 1 o'clock, I had convinced myself to start driving again, carefully down the winding road, tires crunching icy gravel, heater blasting futile warmth, windows up. The frost hand appeared again, larger now, fingers pressing as if testing the glass, stretching outward in impossible ways. I pressed my hand flat against it, trying to measure the depth, the cold biting through my glove, and my mind raced with impossible questions. Was it a trick of condensation? A shadow from a branch? No. The pressure was real. My breath fogged toward the passenger seat as if drawn by something. Something unseen pressing in the cab, curling around me, lingering in the edges of the heater's draft. I swallowed hard, tasting metallic fear on my tongue, fingers trembling, gripping the wheel like a lifeline. By 1:15, I passed the closed roadside diner where I had worked earlier. Neon sign dark, parking lot empty. Yet the frost pressed harder against the passenger window. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, saw a faint number form in the ice, a line etched delicately across the glass before melting into a foggy smear. I cursed under my breath, pulling the wipers across, heart hammering, stomach tight, trying to convince myself it was just condensation playing tricks with moonlight. But I could feel it. A presence. Something quiet, patient, following, waiting, watching. My head whipped to mirrors. Empty road, snow-covered ridges, dense woods pressing close. Nothing. Yet everything felt wrong. By 1:30, I arrived at the cabin rental lot, gravel crunching beneath tires, engine rumbling in the cold air. I pressed the Subaru into park, shivering despite the heater, scarf tight over my ears, gloves stiff from cold. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm hands that refused to relax. My cabin was small, warm, gas-lit porch inviting, and yet the frost hand had followed me, now forming deliberately on the driver's side window. I pressed closer, stomach twisting, noticing faint traces of ice glinting where the numbers had begun to form again. 8, it read. Cabin number, the digits etched in frost, deliberate, impossible. I jerked back, breath caught, fingers fumbling at the keys, fumbling at the lock, every instinct screaming at me that this was no accident. Something had followed me. Something had watched me drive alone in the dark. By 1:45, I stepped inside, shaking, boots scraping gravel, keys in hand, breath misting in the cold air of the entryway. The warm scent of pine cleaner and burnt wood greeted me. Supposed comfort. I turned to the living room window to wipe my fogged glasses, and there it was. Frost, spreading in impossible patterns, fingers pressing flat against the glass, reaching inward. The metallic tang of fear filled my mouth again, stomach dropped, chest tight. I pressed my hands to my thighs, shivering, heart hammering, and realized that the cold was no longer just outside. It was here, inside, pressing through walls, curling around me like smoke, silent but undeniable. My cabin was no longer safe. Not really. By 2, I had forced myself to check every corner of the cabin, every window, every door, pressing hands to locks, adjusting heaters, circling the living space as though sheer presence could keep the frost from moving closer. Each time I glanced at the passenger window of my car in the driveway through the kitchen glass, I saw patterns shifting, hands reaching, stretching toward me, and I realized the impossibility of it. Exhaustion, sleep deprivation, seasonal depression, all of it combined couldn't explain the deliberate, patient pressure of something outside, following, imprinting itself on every reflective surface. My breath fogged the windows as I exhaled, fingers trembling, tasting fear metallic on my tongue, shivering despite layers. By 2:15, I sank onto the couch, pulling my knees close, scarf over my ears, staring at the living room window where frost formed more, rapidly than it could from outside cold. Fingers splayed, pressing flat, curves of digits almost human, deliberate, watching. I could hear the faint whisper of wind in the woods, crunch of snow against gravel, and every sound pressed through the cabin walls like a warning. The heater's hum felt insignificant, shallow warmth useless against what was here. I tried the phone again. Signal gone. Notifications gone. Nothing to reassure me. Just frost, just patterns, just impossible presence. My chest tightened, stomach twisted, hands shaking, breath caught. By 2:30, I noticed the patterns forming shapes I recognized from the road. Hands, numbers, stretched lines, pressing outward, inward, deliberate, watching. I pressed against my thighs again, shivering, taste metallic in my mouth, and realized the impossibility of solitude. The loneliness I carried through the long winter night had been noticed, answered, mirrored by something patient following me home. Something that had waited in the dark curves of the Blue Ridge for nights like this, for someone quiet, alone, vulnerable. Something that had found me, traced me, learned me. By 2:45, I had moved the couch closer to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass, trying to will the patterns to dissipate. But the frost had already begun to reform, fingers pressing inward, digits spreading across the pane, forming new numbers, new marks. I pressed my hands flat to the glass, stomach tightening, breath fogging thick enough to blur the patterns, and realized the shapes were deliberate. Not random, not accident, not reflection. Presence, awareness, a slow, methodical understanding of where I lived, who I was, how I moved, and when I was most vulnerable. By 3, I finally stepped back, hands shaking, boots scuffing the hardwood floor, the heater buzzing faintly, warm only in small bursts. I could feel the frost still pressing against the living room window, patterns spreading, twisting, curling like fingers reaching for me. Metallic taste on my tongue, heart hammering, stomach tight. I realized I had driven the entire Blue Ridge stretch alone, late at night, through snow, into its long shadows, and something had followed. Something patient, quiet, methodical. I looked at the passenger window in my peripheral vision. Faint imprint of a hand, lingering frost, digits stretched long, deliberate. My cabin was not safe. My solitude had been noticed. and I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. Before we jump into the next story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. We really need your love and support. I have always liked the quiet of the mountains, the way snow muffles everything so the world feels suspended, like it's waiting for me to catch up. 3 years ago, in January, I was hiking a stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, trying to lose myself in the white haze and the ache that had lodged in my chest ever since my brother died. He was younger than me, reckless in ways I couldn't stop, and that night I left him behind because I wanted to believe I could make it to the next campsite first. I tell people I was a careful man, a teacher with routines and checklists, but that night, I abandoned the part of myself that should have protected him. I still taste the metallic tang of my own guilt every winter when the wind bites my face. I had set up my tent in a clearing just as the snow started falling hard, the kind of heavy, wet snow that presses down on your shoulders and seems to listen when you whisper. Around 9 o'clock, I thought I heard laughter, faint and far away, echoing like it had no direction. I froze, thinking it might be the wind. Then I realized it sounded like it was coming closer, moving around my tent. I wanted to convince myself it was a group of hikers joking, but I knew it wasn't. The wind didn't carry voices like that. By the time I left the tent to investigate, my boots sinking into the crusted snow, I saw it. A cabin perched above a narrow creek that I did not remember passing. It was old, wooden, darkened with age and frost, with smoke curling from a crooked chimney as if it had been waiting for me. The door was slightly ajar, and what drew me in was not curiosity, but a strange familiarity, like stepping back into a memory I hadn't lived yet. Candlelight flickered behind the windows, though no wind was moving the trees or the smoke, and for a moment I thought maybe someone was inside and I could ask for shelter. But the air was too still, too empty, and a low whisper seemed to slide under my ears, calling my name softly. Ben. Ben. I froze. The sound wasn't right. It was neither entirely male nor female, and it carried a weight that made my stomach curl. I had my backpack, so I stepped closer, boots crunching softly in the snow, and the whispering stopped. Inside, the cabin was small, sparsely furnished with a table, a chair, and a small iron stove. Candles lined the windowsill, their flames bending slightly as though they were leaning toward the door, wanting to guide me in or perhaps warn me away. I remember brushing my hand over one of the wooden beams, and the moment my skin touched it, a chill shot up my arm. It wasn't cold from the snow. It was something else, something hollow. On the table, a photograph lay face up. It was my brother, smiling with his arm around me, a memory I had never seen in reality. I didn't recognize the frame or the way he looked, like he had just stepped from life into some quiet, trapped space. I wanted to pick it up, but the instant I touched it, it dissolved into a smear of frost and candle wax. I laughed nervously, telling myself I must be losing it, that the grief had finally cracked my mind into something that could see memories where they didn't exist. I returned to my tent, my heartbeat a hammer in my chest, and tried to convince myself that the snow and the isolation were making me hallucinate. But over the next few hours, small things began to go wrong. My boots, which I had left neatly outside the tent, were inside by morning, lined up perfectly beside my sleeping bag. A notebook I kept for trail observations appeared open, a single page smeared with fingerprints I didn't have. And when I played a recording I had made of the creek to remember the sound, a soft voice whispered my name between the gurgling water, so low and distant that I almost convinced myself it was the wind. I tried to tell the ranger at the next trail junction, a cheerful man who had seen more storms and missing hikers than I could imagine, and he laughed it off, patting my shoulder. "Ben, you've been out here too long. Winter hikes can get into your head." I nodded, forcing a smile, and left with my notebook under my arm. But the pages were still smeared, the fingerprints stubborn, and the sense of being watched did not go away. Weeks later, I returned to the trail, thinking I might exorcise my memory of the cabin, thinking distance and daylight would cure the tremor in my hands. It was early February, and the snow had softened to a gray sludge, thick with mud beneath. I set up camp in the same clearing, hoping to avoid the place. But when darkness fell, I heard the laughter again. Not playful, but drawn out, stretching over the hills like it had nowhere else to go. I followed it, almost against my own better sense, and there it was again, the cabin. Candles flickered, though I had been certain no one had been inside. I pressed my face to the frosted window and saw it. Shadows moving inside, like someone pacing, their head turned toward me even though I knew they could not see me. I felt my chest tighten, as if it were remembering something I had tried to forget. The night I left my brother behind. That laughter felt like him, or the echo of him, accusing me without words. I did not go inside at first. I watched from the snow, watching the way the flames bent unnaturally, leaning toward the door. Then a whisper. "Ben?" This time it carried urgency, desperation. My knees went weak, and I forced myself forward. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and cold ash, and a new candle had been lit, one I had not seen before. On the table was a notebook, my handwriting on the cover, though I hadn't written it. Opening it, the words scrawled inside made my blood run cold. "You cannot leave me." My hands shook, and I dropped it, but it did not fall to the floor. It hovered slightly, the pages flapping though there was no wind. I stepped back and tripped over the threshold, scraping my forearm on the rough wood. I looked down and saw a bruise forming in the shape of a handprint. I could feel the pressure, the warmth of it, though no one had touched me. The bruise stayed for days, and when I rubbed it, it throbbed, reminding me that the cabin's presence was not a dream. I stopped trying to rationalize after that night. The cabin began to appear in my hikes every winter, sometimes on stretches I had walked dozens of times without noticing it. Friends who accompanied me once or twice swore they didn't see anything, laughed when I pointed, but I could feel it, smell it, hear the faint whisper of a name I never wanted to hear again. I tried leaving photographs of it behind, notebook entries, recordings, anything to prove I had not gone mad. The photos developed gray smears where the windows should be, the recordings warped into static and whispers. No one else could interpret them. Even my wife, when I brought her to the trail, said nothing looked unusual, but she reached for my arm and recoiled when she touched the bruise that never healed fully, a crescent mark that throbbed with cold dread. I wanted to say it was nothing, that my mind had simply clung to grief, but even now it reminds me every winter of what I left behind. Once, I stayed in the cabin longer than I should have, unable to tear myself away. The whispering grew louder, closer, voices overlapping, crying my name and my brother's, and I felt hands brushing my shoulders, tugging at my jacket, trying to pull me into the dark corners of the room. I thought I might collapse, but then I remembered him, the one I had left, and I screamed at the shadows, my own voice breaking in the hollow air. The voices paused, and I ran, tripping over roots and snow, the candlelight shrinking behind me like it had never existed. When I finally looked back, the cabin was gone, nothing but an empty clearing. But I knew it had not left me. It never leaves. I still hike in the winter. Every year I pass that stretch of trail, the air tasting metallic and cold in my mouth, my boots crunching over hardened snow. And always, there it is, waiting on the rise above the creek, candles lit even when there is no wind, shadows pacing behind frosted windows, whispers threading through the trees. I have learned a rhythm to avoid it, a silent negotiation. Don't follow, don't touch, don't speak aloud. And yet, the mark on my arm, the smeared notebook, the sound of my brother's voice carried in laughter, these remain, reminders that I am never alone when the snow falls hard. If you hike that section in winter, if the snow presses down on your shoulders and the wind seems too still, be wary of a cabin that appears where none should exist. Watch the candles. Listen for your name. Step back and do not enter. The rest of it, the whispers, the shifting shadows, the cold handprints that will appear where there is no hand. That you cannot avoid. I know because I have. I still see it, every winter, above the creek. And every winter, I remember leaving him behind. I had been driving I-90 through Pennsylvania for hours, fog rolling across the asphalt in thick, wet blankets, headlights glinting against the slick road and reflecting back like pale eyes watching me. I'm 30, a nurse, and that evening had been long, filled with overtime at the hospital. After the holiday rush left, everyone stretched thin. I'd been alone for most of the drive, my only companions the low hum of the engine, the swish of windshield wipers, and the occasional tolling of my phone alarms reminding me of appointments I hadn't kept, messages from friends I hadn't returned. I was used to traveling alone, the isolation something I clung to after years of being let down, of people leaving at unexpected times, of my own failures to hold things together. That night, the fog was so heavy it felt like a living thing, pressing against the car, muffling sound and depth, making the familiar highway seem endless. I had been watching the road, tense, hands gripping the wheel when the rest stop appeared, suddenly bustling, glowing under the sodium lights, people moving between cars and vending machines, laughing softly, the sound distorted in the mist. At first, relief washed over me. I needed a break, a moment to stretch and breathe, and the idea of a warm coffee and a bathroom made me almost giddy. But as I parked and stepped out, the fog seemed to pull back, revealing only empty asphalt. The people, so vivid in my headlights, were gone. I called out, half laughing, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But the fog swallowed my voice immediately. I walked a few steps toward where I had seen a group near the vending machines, and the wet asphalt echoed my own footsteps, crisp and hollow. A small, seemingly innocent detail caught my eye. A lone coffee cup, tipped over, steam curling upward in the cold air. It seemed so ordinary, yet my stomach tightened. I reached for it, and the moment my fingers brushed the rim, it vanished, leaving only a wet ring on the asphalt. I told myself it was fog playing tricks, light refracting strangely, but a cold knot settled in my chest. The hospital had taught me to notice patterns, signs, vital details, and now every instinct screamed that something was wrong. I returned to my car, heart still hammering, but the rest stop appeared to return to normal as I backed out. The same group of people standing at the vending machines, chatting and moving, completely oblivious to me. I blinked and adjusted my rearview mirror, trying to ground myself. And when I glanced at the cup I had touched, it reappeared on the asphalt, tipped, wet, and cold. I started driving again, headlights cutting through the fog. But I felt the sensation of being watched, the weight of isolation pressing tighter than ever. I tried calling my sister, desperate for human connection. but the call wouldn't connect. The fog thickened, and with it came whispers, faint, almost beneath the wind, calling my name, teasing it out like a ribbon through the night. I swore I heard Maya carried with the wind, over and over, so soft I wondered if I had imagined it. My chest felt tight, anxiety building like a storm inside me. The second time I passed the rest stop, it was entirely empty, yet I could feel the energy of people lingering, shadows brushing against the corner of my vision. My headlights reflected in puddles, giving the illusion of movement, but the shapes weren't entirely my own. I slowed the car, almost stopping, trying to convince myself I was seeing ordinary shadows and reflections. But the wet asphalt echoed the distinct rhythm of footsteps behind me. I reached over to check the side mirror and froze. In the reflection, a figure crouched beside the vending machines, head tilted slightly, watching me. I blinked, and it vanished. My pulse thudded against my temples, metallic and sour on my tongue, a reminder of every night I had spent alone, every shift where I had held life in my hands and watched it slip away despite my best efforts. By the time I reached the next exit, I had begun keeping my hand on the door lock, eyes flicking between mirrors, headlights searching the fog. I pulled over at a small diner, one of those late-night, neon-lit places that promised warmth and coffee, and tried to rationalize what had happened. The diner was empty except for the night cook, a stocky man wiping down the counter. I told him about the rest stop, the people who vanished, the whispers calling my name. He smiled, a shrug, and said it must have been fog, that these things happen, especially when you're tired. I nodded, forcing a smile, but I felt more alone than ever. Even when someone is near, someone who can touch and speak and affirm reality, I felt the isolation creeping back, relentless. Returning to the highway, I kept my speed low, the fog heavy and damp. The rest stop appeared again, the group in place once more, laughing, moving, tangible in my headlights. I considered stopping, heart hammering, but my rational mind screamed no. I passed slowly, my eyes searching, and again they were gone. Footsteps echoed, distinct and deliberate, behind me, but when I glanced in the mirrors, there was nothing. A shiver ran down my spine, and I gripped the wheel harder, knuckles white. Every instinct told me to flee, to put miles between me and that stretch of fog. But some part of me was drawn to it, to see what I had glimpsed, to confront the emptiness, even if it was just a trick of exhaustion and winter mist. The next encounter was the most unsettling. I had stopped at a bridge over a small creek, headlights catching the fog in swirling patterns, and there it was again, not in the rest stop, but along the guardrail. A figure leaned casually, watching, and though I couldn't make out features, the familiarity, the posture, felt intimately threatening. I reached for my phone, hands trembling, and snapped a picture. When I looked at the screen, the figure appeared only as a blur, the fog twisting it into something unrecognizable. I lowered the phone and felt the echo of footsteps behind me, closer now, keeping pace with my own. I shouted, demanding it show itself, but the fog answered with silence. My reflection in the rear view caught movement that I could not explain. Something crouched just out of view, shifting with my car's motion. A small bruise had formed on my forearm from gripping the wheel earlier, a physical reminder that this wasn't entirely imagined. The night stretched endlessly, each mile bringing a repetition of appearances and vanishings. I passed the rest stop multiple times, sometimes empty, sometimes bustling, sometimes showing just a single figure standing alone, gazing at me with something I could not name. And every time my chest tightened, the metallic taste of fear rising in my mouth. I tried to rationalize, thinking my exhaustion and recent feelings of abandonment were manifesting as hallucinations, but the bruise and the corrupted photos suggested otherwise. I was not losing my mind. Something about that stretch of fog was breaking the rules I understood, the boundaries of time, presence, and perception bending in ways that left my nerves raw and my mind uneasy. Finally, nearing the turnpike toward my apartment, the fog began to thin, leaving the highway wet and reflective, moonlight glinting on puddles. I was exhausted, trembling, but relief was near. Still, I could not stop checking mirrors, every reflective surface catching my eye, every movement in shadows making me flinch. As I exited, I noticed shapes in the mirrors that did not belong, silhouettes lingering at the edge of vision just for a moment before slipping away. I pulled into my driveway, heart hammering, and left the car running as I stood on the porch, chest heaving, fingers cold and stiff. Even in my own yard, in the safety of my home, the haunting sensation remained, a quiet insistence that I was not alone, that the night's events had left a residue that could not be erased. The next morning, I tried to tell a friend about it, showing her the photos, the corrupted images, the faint bruise on my arm. She looked at them, shrugged, and said I must have been stressed, that traveling alone in fog does strange things to perception. I nodded, though inside I knew better. Dismissal from others only deepened the isolation, the feeling of being left to face something incomprehensible by myself. I began keeping a small notebook, writing times, observations, and sketches of the shapes, the vanishing figures, and even that cup that had appeared and disappeared. Every snowfall, every foggy night brought a reminder. Sometimes when I drive, shapes linger in the mirrors, faint and flickering, never fully forming, but enough to make my chest tighten and my hands tremble on the wheel. Weeks passed, yet the pattern persisted. I avoided the highway when possible, kept my lights bright, and drove slower than necessary, always scanning the edges, always aware of the whispering fog. At night, when the house was silent, I would glance through windows and see faint shapes reflecting in the glass, indistinct, watching. I tried to dismiss them, tried to tell myself it was memory or imagination, but the bruise on my forearm had never faded completely, stubborn and unyielding, a reminder that what I had experienced had left its mark, physically and mentally. Now, even months later, I carry the night with me. I cannot pass fog without unease, cannot stop at a rest area without scanning it first. The echo of footsteps on wet asphalt is permanently stitched into memory. The whispers of my name carried by the wind impossible to forget. I keep a small warning for anyone who travels alone in winter or fog. If a rest stop appears suddenly, bustling with life, trust only what you can reach, touch, and verify yourself. Approach carefully and do not linger for curiosity. There are things at the edges of perception that will vanish if confronted, yet leave a residue that follows you, just as it followed me through that cold Pennsylvania night. I had been driving Route 1 through Maine for hours, the windshield streaked with snow and ice, the cab of the rig smelling faintly of diesel and stale coffee. I'm 45, a trucker by trade, used to solitude and long stretches of road, but even I felt the weight of isolation more keenly that January night. My family hadn't spoken to me in years, not because of anything spectacular, just small things, missed birthdays, forgotten calls, arguments left unresolved. The distance had grown until it felt permanent. I was homesick in a way I could barely articulate, the loneliness pressing into the cab like the wind rattling the mirrors. Somewhere north of Bangor, the storm thickened, snow blurring the world into white, and my headlights barely penetrated more than 50 feet. I hadn't planned to stop, but the gas gauge nudged closer to empty, and I knew I wouldn't make the next town without filling up. The station appeared through the haze like a haloed promise. Its lights glowed weakly through the storm, a few cars parked in odd slants, their owners invisible behind frost-coated windows. I climbed out of the cab, boots crunching against snow-packed asphalt, and the wind carried a chill that cut right through my coat. I heard it first then. The lullaby. A soft, melodic voice, clear and human, singing from somewhere in the woods that edged the lot. At first, I thought a stranded traveler had stopped for shelter, but there was no flashlight, no car, no figure moving. Just the song, ebbing and flowing with the wind, notes rising and falling, echoing faintly inside the cab, as if the music itself had found its way into the vehicle. I told myself it was the storm playing tricks, or maybe my mind stretching under the weight of exhaustion and guilt over the years I had let pass without trying to repair the broken threads with my family. I went inside to pay for fuel, shaking slightly, hoping warmth and light would anchor me. The clerk, a young guy named Tony, looked up as I shuffled my change. I mentioned the singing, laughing it off nervously, expecting some common explanation. He frowned. "Nobody else here. You sure it's not the heater rattling or the wind in the trees?" I nodded, though my stomach twisted. It was too deliberate, too structured, the kind of lullaby I remembered my mother humming when I was a boy. That memory hit harder than I expected, a pang of regret twisting in my chest. The song seemed to know, to reach for something I had neglected for decades, the comfort I could not give or receive. Back in the cab, I filled the tank, trying to dismiss the feeling of eyes on me, the subtle unease crawling over my skin. The lullaby returned as soon as I shut the doors, floating from the dark tree line into the cab, echoing around the mirrors and metal surfaces. I reached for the CB, hoping to call another driver for company, but static filled the channel. The voice carried, repeating, bending around the engine's hum. I tried to trace it, shining a flashlight toward the edge of the lot, and the wind carried the notes, swirling them like smoke, teasing me with something just out of reach. My hands trembled, gripping the wheel tighter, heart thudding against my ribs, metallic and bitter in my mouth. The music grew louder as I eased the truck onto the highway, drifting along the edge of the storm, the lullaby lingering like an unseen passenger. Hours passed, the snow relentless, the headlights cutting a narrow swath through white, and still the voice followed. I stopped at another small turnout, hoping the stationary truck would dull the hallucination, and grabbed my camera, snapping pictures toward the woods. The prints came out blurred, a smear of shadow, the snow bending light into impossible shapes. Nothing solid, nothing real to grasp, yet tangible enough to unsettle. I rubbed my arm absent-mindedly and noticed a faint scrape, red and tender, likely from bumping the cab's door earlier, but now I associated it with the presence, a physical reminder that the night had left its mark. I pocketed the camera, its images corrupted, indecipherable, yet refusing to erase the memory of what I had heard. By midnight, the lullaby had embedded itself in the cab. Every turn, every curve of Route 1 seemed to carry the notes along, the song echoing off metal, sliding into the speakers of the rig, sometimes soft, sometimes insistent. I kept glancing at the tree line, imagining shadows moving just beyond the headlights. The snowstorm blurred distance and time, and I felt the weight of every wrong word I had spoken, every missed visit, every empty call to my family, pressing at the edges of perception. The lullaby was a haunting of my own making, or perhaps something more, some consciousness attuned to my isolation and regret. At one rest stop, I saw movement, not human exactly, but something shifting in the periphery. The lullaby rose, clear and unrelenting. I stepped out, boots sinking into wet snow, and the sound shifted with me, like a living presence, circling, teasing, beckoning. I saw no one, just the empty asphalt, the trees, the snowflakes falling in slow, deliberate patterns. I called out, my voice trembling, "Who's there?" The wind answered, carrying only the song. I felt my throat tighten, the memory of my daughter's face when I hadn't come home for her birthday 5 years ago, the way my wife had turned away, unresolved grief stacking over time. I shoved back into the cab, shivering, adrenaline coiling like wire in my veins. The lullaby persisted through Maine's dark hours. I tried radio, tried music from the rig's stereo, anything to drown it out, but the notes threaded around the speakers, weaving into the cab, echoing across the dashboard. I began recording, hoping to capture proof, a rational anchor against the impossible, but playback was distorted. The melody would start correctly, then smear into warped echoes, like memory itself breaking. Tony, the clerk at the first station, didn't believe me when I tried to share it later, laughing it off as a trick of tired nerves, and I nodded, forcing a shrug, though it felt like dismissal, another layer of isolation. The night pressed on, relentless, and every time I glanced into the mirrors, I swore I saw movement, shadows shifting just out of focus, waiting, accompanying me like a specter of my own neglect. At a small bridge over a frozen creek, I stopped again. The lullaby surrounded me now, notes bouncing, wrapping into the cab, pressing against the thin insulation. The wind carried a cold draft under the doors, but even when I closed the windows fully, the music persisted. I reached out to the tree line, almost touching the air, expecting nothing, yet I could feel a pull, a sorrowful insistence in the notes, drawing me toward memories I had tried to bury. I snapped another photo, and again the image came back corrupted, a smear of white and gray, the outlines of something, someone, impossible to discern. My arm brushed the edge of the seat, leaving a faint bruise, tender and real, proof that the night had touched me physically, not just in the mind. I started driving again, the lullaby softening as I gained miles, fading into the hum of the engine. But even as the storm thinned and Route 1 became clearer, the song lingered faintly in the mirrors, a whisper that twisted with the wind. For weeks afterward, I caught it sometimes in the cab, faint and insistent, like a memory that refused to die. I kept a notebook with me, sketches of the tree line, notes of time and location, fragments of melody, anything to make sense of what I had heard, but the pages themselves seemed to shift, lines blurring when I looked away, stubbornly resisting clarity. It's been years since that night, yet every trip north on Route 1 carries a shadow of it. The lullaby never fully disappears, not in my cab, not in my mind. It waits in the tree line, soft and sorrowful, a reminder of absence and regret. I haven't tried to see it again directly, haven't dared approach the woods where the notes first rose, but I know it's there, present in ways subtle and haunting. I can feel the echoes in mirrors, sometimes when I'm stopped at other stations, a chill that rises along my spine, the metallic taste of fear lingering. The bruise from that night never fully healed, a faint mark on my forearm that I touch sometimes, a reminder that what I experienced was real and that the highway carries more than asphalt and ice. The lesson I've learned is quiet but persistent. When you hear a song drifting from the woods, soft, familiar, carrying the ache of a life you've neglected, do not approach it. Do not try to find the source. Listen, acknowledge, and move on. It doesn't ask for confrontation, only attention, and the cost of ignoring the warning is the unshakable echo of absence, the reminder of all the moments you let slip away. Every time I stop at a gas station, in the snow I glance toward the trees, half expecting the melody, and every time it comes, I grip the wheel tighter, humming a quiet, trembling reply, knowing that the song is patient, relentless, and somehow intimately tied to the failures I carry with me. I've always preferred driving alone at night, the quiet of the Appalachian backroads giving me a strange sense of control, a way to process thoughts without interruption. I'm 29, a grad student, isolated more by habit than circumstance, and the solitude has always been comfortable, even when it bordered on paranoia. Last February, snow covered the roads in heavy drifts, and the curves of Route 37 became treacherous under the dim wash of my headlights. I had been heading to a research site several counties over, my thoughts tangled with unfinished papers, emails unanswered, and the low-grade anxiety that always follows me home from campus. My life felt like a constant negotiation with unease, and that night it seemed magnified by the storm, the silence, and the endless whiteness pressing against my windshield. The first time I noticed it, I was rounding a sharp curve, and there it was. A tiny red reflector just off the road, catching the low beam of my headlights. I slowed, thinking it a marker for the bend, the kind left for plows or lost drivers. It glinted back at me, steady, unnerving in its precision. I shook my head and told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks, but the reflection lingered in the passenger side mirror, stubborn and exact, as though watching me. The road behind me was empty, and the wind whispered through the bare branches of the pines, carrying a cold metallic taste into the cab. Something about the way the reflector caught the light made me feel like I was being followed, not by a person, but by an intention, a gaze that tracked my every turn. I tried to dismiss it, gripping the wheel tighter and muttering under my breath about fatigue and overthinking. Minutes later, as I crested a rise, another red glint appeared around the next curve, the same precise, bright reflection. I swerved slightly, heart thudding, and saw it again in my mirrors, too perfectly aligned to be random. I rationalized. It was a hazard marker, a misplaced reflector, a product of snow-shifted road construction. But the unease settled in my chest, pressing tight against my ribs. I remembered the night my father had disappeared on a similar stretch of road years ago. The way my mother had always avoided those back roads, and the sense of helplessness had buried itself in me. The red reflectors, innocent as they seemed, became symbols of that fear, reminders of the unseen things that could appear without warning. By the time I reached the next stretch, I noticed them at almost every corner. They were never exactly the same, sometimes perched higher on tree trunks, sometimes low in the snow, but each catch of red light seemed deliberate in a way that made my hands sweat on the wheel. I started taking pictures with my phone, trying to anchor reality with proof. But when I reviewed the images later, the reflectors blurred into the night, smudged by light and snow in ways that made them almost unrecognizable. When I showed the photos to my roommate, Jamie, she frowned, adjusting her glasses. "It's just snow and light reflecting," she said. "Stop imagining patterns where there aren't any." I nodded, forcing a laugh, though the tremor in my hands betrayed my tension. Isolation had sharpened my senses, made the back roads feel alive with intent, and now someone else's dismissal only tightened the coil in my chest. The night deepened, and the snow made the road treacherous. I slowed, the reflectors catching every headlight arc, and sometimes I swear one would appear closer than it had been a minute before, glinting in the side mirror as if it had moved while I wasn't looking. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that exhaustion was bending reality. But the feeling of being observed persisted, crawling along the nape of my neck, and I began checking every mirror obsessively, heart hammering, expecting movement I couldn't explain. At one point, I noticed a shallow scratch on my forearm, where the sleeve of my jacket had rubbed raw against the door handle. It hurt, real enough to prove that this night was not entirely the product of imagination. I tucked my arm beneath the steering wheel, trying to focus on the road. The way the red reflections continued to dot the curves ahead, precise, deliberate, unyielding. The next encounter came at a long stretch through dense pines. I rounded a bend, and the reflector seemed to split into two, one on each side of the road, perfectly aligned with the car. My stomach churned. I swerved slightly, nearly sliding into the ditch, and the reflections held their positions, impossible in their symmetry. I grabbed my phone again, snapping photos, but the images returned as distorted, the red glow stretching unnaturally across the frames. Jamie, when I showed her later, laughed lightly, as if it were a joke, but I could see the tension in her eyes when she looked away. She claimed I had dropped my phone while taking pictures, and that explained the blur, but the scratch on my forearm remained, a quiet, stubborn proof that the night had left more than fear. Hours passed, and the road became a ribbon of white in my headlights. I saw them at nearly every curve now, red and precise, and sometimes it felt like they anticipated my turns, appearing sooner than I expected, reflecting with a cruel timing. At one point, I stopped at a small overlook to catch my breath, snow crunching under my boots. The reflection appeared in the mirror of my rear-view camera, though nothing should have been there. I leaned closer, straining, and caught the glint of red in the tree line, watching it hold my gaze as though it had a consciousness, patient, silent, deliberate. I felt the familiar prickle of anxiety that had always been my companion, the fear of unseen eyes and the deep, gnawing regret of every moment I had failed to act in life, every chance I had ignored to reach out, connect, care. The reflectors seemed to know that loneliness, that worry, and they pressed it back to me with each shimmer. At another bend, my headlights caught it moving, or so it seemed. I turned sharply, trying to keep the car centered on the narrow lane, and the red reflection glimmered, seeming closer, as if it had stepped into the road. I slammed the wheel straight, heart hammering, and it vanished, leaving only the whiteness of snow and the dark outline of trees. I told myself it was a trick of light, but the tremor in my hands and the shallow scratch on my forearm reminded me that this night had left physical traces, proof that I was not imagining everything. The anxiety tightened into something more primal, a fear of what I could not see, of a presence just beyond perception, patient, waiting. By dawn, the road had thinned, the storm lessened, but the reflectors persisted. I stopped at a small diner to collect myself, the red glints still lingering in the mirrors outside. I tried to rationalize, convincing myself they were standard markers, reflective tape catching my headlights. The waitress, an older woman with a gentle face, asked if I had driven far, and I mentioned the strange reflections. She frowned, shaking her head. "You've been driving too long. Go home and rest." She smiled kindly, but her words carried dismissal, a subtle confirmation that I was alone in this, that no one could verify what I had seen. The final stretch home was the worst. I could feel the reflectors tracking me, their red gleam faint but persistent in mirrors, in the corners of my eyes, as if they had taken on a life independent of the road. I wanted to drive faster, to escape, but the snow and curves forced caution, and the reflection moved with me, sometimes disappearing only to reappear on the next corner, patient and deliberate. I parked in my driveway eventually, heart pounding, shaking hands resting on the wheel, and in the mirror I caught a final flicker of red in the pines bordering my yard. I shook my head, telling myself it was over, but the feeling of being observed persisted, creeping along the back of my skull. Weeks later, I noticed the reflections even when driving familiar roads near campus, faint glimmers in mirrors, red and precise, holding my gaze. I scratched my forearm absent-mindedly, the mark still faintly tender, stubborn proof that the experience had been real. My notebook, where I sketched the curves and marked the locations, still held smudged, corrupted images of the reflectors, light bending in impossible ways, resisting rational explanation. I thought I could ignore them, could convince myself it was fatigue, paranoia, or coincidence, but even in my apartment I catch glints out of the window at night, reflections that seem impossibly positioned, deliberate, patient, silent. I have stopped trying to anticipate them, stopped trying to photograph or measure, stopped trying to explain. I drive cautiously now, slow on curves, glancing at mirrors obsessively, noting every red glint, every reflection that catches my attention. The Appalachian backroads are quiet, empty, and familiar, yet every turn carries the potential for the same precise, impossible red, waiting for a moment to remind me that I am never truly alone, that my anxiety and vigilance have invited something persistent, a silent companion that moves with me. The lesson is quiet, insistent. If you see a red glint in the dark, small, precise, reflecting in your mirrors, do not assume it is random. Do not dismiss the feeling in your chest, the pull of awareness in your periphery. A reflection that moves when you are still, that anticipates your turns, is not harmless. Observe, record if you must, but never let yourself approach it directly, and do not imagine it will disappear once you leave the road. It may follow, patient and deliberate, long after the snow has melted and the curves are familiar. I have learned to live with it, this subtle, insistent presence, and I know it will be with me for years, moving quietly in the edges of my vision, marking every curve, every turn, every quiet stretch of road I think is mine alone. I rolled off the highway just after 11:45, tired enough to feel like my spine had been sanded raw. Headlights caught snowflakes like tiny shards of glass, and the tires crunched over slush in the rest stop lot. Inside the cabin-like structure, fluorescent lights flickered faintly, humming over the low murmur of vending machines and the faint hiss of a radiator in the corner. I pushed open the door, the scent of coffee hitting me first, strong and slightly bitter, undercut with the faint tang of something metallic. It wasn't home, but it was comforting, predictable. I always liked rest stops like this on long drives, quiet, empty, the small smell of fried food and cleaning soap lingering, and a warm cup waiting in hand. Nothing ever went wrong, at least nothing I couldn't handle. I'd make my coffee, sit for a few minutes, warm up, maybe check the car stereo, then be back on the road. Simple. Routine. Safe. By midnight, I'd grabbed a paper cup and filled it, the bitter steam curling into my face. The room felt bigger than I expected, even though outside it looked modest. Tables spaced oddly, a small seating area tucked past the snack aisle, and the walls seemed farther apart. Coffee smelled strong, almost overpowering, and the low hum of fluorescent bulbs buzzed in the back of my skull. I leaned against the counter, hand brushing the cold metal of the vending machine beside me, trying to shake off the fatigue pressing on my shoulders. My reflection in the glass caught my own eyes, dark and tired, and I felt a brief twist of comfort in the normalcy. Everything felt right, like I could relax. And yet, a tiny thread of unease tugged at the edge of awareness, something I shoved aside immediately. By 12:20, I wandered toward the far end of the room, headphones dangling around my neck. Footsteps echoed oddly, ahead of me, but not quite matching my pace. Pause. Hunched over slightly, I told myself I was imagining it, maybe the sound bouncing wrong in the room. But then, a faint metallic shake from the vending machine beside me. Not enough to move anything inside, just vibrating under my palm. My fingers tightened around the edge, the cold metal biting, and I took a slow breath. Probably someone stalking it, I muttered to myself. Maybe. Maybe not. My eyes flicked to the shadow moving just outside the aisle, something tall and thin, disappearing when I blinked. No one else in the room. Long enough to feel pulse spike, short enough to wonder if exhaustion had me seeing things. By 1:10, I had circled the seating area, tapping cup against tabletop, listening. The hum of lights buzzing irregularly, shadows shifting too fast to track. The floor creaked faintly, footsteps echoing, but again, nothing in sight. I bent over, listening, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. Maybe it was the building settling. Maybe a stray animal outside rattling something metal. Maybe. Long enough to convince myself that I was fine, that I was imagining it. Coffee steaming in hand, I took a sip. Bitter, metallic, sharp, burning a little too much down my throat. Nothing else? Nothing obvious. Just flicker and hum and snow crunching faintly outside in the lot. By 1:50, I wandered to the door, brushing my coat against the frame. Snow lay outside, crisp, untouched. I squinted at the parking lot, headlights fading into forest, trees bending under heavy snow. Footsteps? None. I stepped back inside. A map on the wall indicated an exit to the gas station across the highway, but the signs inside pointed in ways that didn't make sense. Hallways bending oddly, doors appearing where there shouldn't be. I shook my head. Too tired, I whispered. My reflection in the vending machine glass warped strangely, angles off, edges sharp. Long enough to feel my stomach tighten, pulse stiffen, breath shallow. Could be fatigue, could be imagination. Probably imagination. By 2:40, I tried the restroom, shaking off the creeping tension. Flickering lights buzzed overhead, faucet dripping steadily, scent of bleach cutting through the coffee fumes. I washed my hands, cold water biting skin, and paused. The hum. The building's lights, or something else? In the mirror, reflection stretched slightly, not quite aligned with my movements. Blinked, normal again. Footsteps echoing outside the door. Not mine, not expected. I stepped out. Empty hall. Long enough to swallow, tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe a janitor. Maybe a car pulled in without me noticing. Maybe. By 3:20, the room felt smaller, oddly intimate despite the empty tables. Coffee long gone lukewarm, aroma fading but metallic tang lingering. I tapped fingers on counter, low hum of lights pressing into skull. The shadow passed again, peripheral vision catching something tall, thin, not moving like a person. I turned quickly, nothing. Floorboards creaked faintly, vending machine buzzed low. I swallowed hard, pulse knotting in chest. Could be fatigue, could be stress. Long enough to feel sweat prickling on neck. I traced edges of tables, leaned close to walls, listening. Whisper? Not loud, subtle, a hiss through static of my radio in the car. Diego. My name, hissing in the low frequency of tires, engine, snow, not human, not machine. Definitely there. By 4:15, I wandered toward the snack aisle again, shaking lightly, fingers brushing cool metal. The lights flickered more aggressively, low hum warping, subtle enough that my chest tightened. Vending machine rattled again, nothing inside, just metal shaking under touch. I stepped back, breath catching, hand on forehead, headphones slipping around neck, wires tangling, Floorboards creaked faintly, footsteps just ahead. Pacing corridor I could see through reflection. Hallways bending, exits leading to walls, doors that didn't exist outside. Long enough to feel chest tighten, stomach knot, breath shallow. Metallic tang sharp in mouth, pulse spiking. By 5, tried the far door leading towards highway gas station. Snow outside glimmered, crisp, undisturbed. Walked toward it. The corridor seemed longer than it should have, walls stretching slightly, lights bending oddly, footsteps echoing. Shadow flicked past just outside peripheral vision, stopping when I looked. Nothing visible. Hum and buzz of lights intensified, vibrating in skull. Coffee still bitter, metallic tang sharp, pulse stiffening, breath uneven. Long enough to shake off sudden nausea, decide to keep moving. By 5:45, I returned to main area, pacing slowly. Vending machine rattled faintly again, lights flickered, shadow in corner. Whispering through static of car radio in pocket. Diego. Low, coaxing, deliberate. Stomach dropped, metallic tang biting, floorboards cold beneath shoes. Something deliberately wrong in space. Length of hallways changed subtly, tables farther apart, corners curling in flickering light. I traced edges, leaned close, hand pressed to cool metal. Something here, moving around, waiting. Not human, not machine. Something patient. By 6:30, I tried the far end again, doors appearing in wrong places, signs pointing nowhere, light bending oddly. Steps echoing, not matching expected patterns. Faint reflection of movement in vending glass. Metallic tang heavy, pulse tight, stomach twisting. Whisper persistent, faint, coaxing. Coffee cold, acrid, hum shifting. I stepped back toward door, intent on leaving. Snow outside, crisp, untouched, no footprints in lot. Metallic tang sharp in mouth, breath catching, pulse stiffening. By 7, decision made. Keys in hand, I pushed open car door. Snow outside pristine, lights from rest stop glinting faintly. Turned on GPS, rest stop gone. Coordinates blank, highway winding ahead, nothing but snow, trees, mountains. Footsteps faint in my mind, crunching snow, following, just behind. I shook off, tried engine radio, signal weak. Static in radio hissed again. Diego. Not my voice, not mechanical. Something coaxing, deliberate, present. By 7:30, highway stretching ahead, snow glinting under dim moonlight. Rearview mirror reflected trees, shadows shifting, something following faintly in stillness. No sound of engine, no lights, just presence. Pulse tight, stomach knotting, breath uneven, fingers tight on wheel. I kept moving, headlights slicing fog, radio static hissing low, long enough to feel dread settle deep, metallic tang in mouth lingering, snow crunch faintly echoing outside. By 8, town lights faintly ahead. Snow softened, streets familiar, car smooth under tires, radio silent now. Breath steady, pulse slowly relaxing. Yet something shifted faintly in reflection. Shadows in rear view twisting, curling, too deliberate, too patient, metallic tang lingering in mouth, presence subtle, following. Snow outside untouched, crisp. I swallowed, headlights warm, pulse steady. By 8:45, familiar streets beneath tires, home near, engine hum steady, snow melting. Slightly, wind cold, biting. Car parked, doors locked, radio silent. Still reflection caught something faint behind me, peripheral, shadows stretching slightly too long. Pulse tightened faintly, stomach twisting, breathing shallow, hands still on wheel, metallic tang lingering. Quiet. Too quiet. Outside, snow untouched, lot empty, shadows patient. Something here, unseen, waiting. And I wasn't going to wait to see if it would move first. I've been driving back and forth along the same roads for years now, routine so deeply embedded in my bones that I could practically drive them with my eyes closed. I'd been on the road for hours that day, winding through Vermont's backcountry, heading home from a work trip in the city. It was January, the kind of snowstorm that hits hard enough to reduce visibility, but soft enough to feel peaceful, even though the chill dug through the layers of my jacket. The road was mostly deserted, the trees on either side bare and haunting, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to nothing. I'd been on this stretch before, plenty of times, but something about it felt off tonight. Maybe it was the solitude, or the fatigue, or maybe just the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right. I was used to the isolation of driving at night, especially this time of year when most people stay off the roads. But as I came up on a toll booth, I was surprised to see the light still on, the booth standing out in the middle of nowhere, like some strange anomaly. It wasn't one of those newer automated tolls, but one of the old-fashioned ones, with the little window and the thick glass. I slowed, preparing for the toll, though I'd never seen another car on this route. There she was, standing in the booth. A woman, bundled in a heavy coat, fur-lined hood pulled tight around her face. She didn't look out of place until she did. She looked frozen. Like someone had dropped her there, untouched by time, her clothes too old-fashioned, too thick for the weather, even for the winter chill. I shook my head, assuming it was fatigue messing with me. I reached for my wallet, grabbed a few bills, but she shook her head, holding up a hand as though she had no intention of taking them. Instead, she handed me the change. The thing is, the coins felt icy in my hand, like they had been sitting in the snow for hours, cold enough to sting. I remember the exact moment they touched my palm, a sharp bite of cold. And when I looked at them, really looked at them, I realized the numbers were off. The quarters and dimes, their years stamped in the metal, were all from a year I didn't recognize. Decades ago, maybe, and I'd never seen them in circulation. They were too old. They didn't make sense. But when I looked up, I was confused to see her still standing there, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, though her eyes never met mine. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. Something about her seemed wrong, out of place, like she didn't belong there. I drove off without another thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the toll booth, the woman, had somehow just been waiting for me. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror as I continued down the road, but the booth was gone. No sign of the woman. Nothing. Just the empty stretch of road, white and unbroken in the glow of my headlights. It made no sense. It didn't add up. I tried to laugh it off, thinking I'd been overworked, maybe just too tired, or that the cold was playing tricks on my mind. But something nagged at me. It wasn't just the coins. I kept thinking about how odd it was that the toll booth was still open when no one else was on the road. I tried to remember if I'd even seen a car before mine. I couldn't. And then the worst part. The coins. They were still in my pocket, heavy and cold, and when I reached in to check them, they were the same ones. The old ones, marked with those unfamiliar years, the frost still clinging to the edges like they had just been pulled out of a snowbank. That night, when I got home, I checked the coins again. The same quarters, the same dimes, old enough to be relics. I'd never seen anything like them before. I thought maybe I'd picked them up at a gas station or a change jar in some old store, but I couldn't remember where. I couldn't remember when. And then, as I stood there staring at them, I realized that the years on the coins, the ones I'd seen in the toll booth, they didn't just feel wrong. They felt wrong in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Like the kind of mistake you don't make. Like something that doesn't belong to you. I tried to go to sleep that night, but the cold lingered. That woman, her strange, frozen smile, the way she handed me those coins like they had a purpose, like they had been waiting for me. I kept thinking about the way she stood there, unmoving, unblinking. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened during that drive. I'd seen things I shouldn't have. Or worse, things that weren't supposed to be there. I looked up old toll booths, tried to find records of any woman who had worked there, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. I called the Vermont Highway Department, but they told me the booth had been closed for years. That only made things worse. The coins, the woman, the toll booth that wasn't supposed to be there. I couldn't let it go. I drove back down that road, hoping for some answer, some closure. But when I reached the spot where the toll booth had been, there was nothing. No booth, no woman, no sign of the strange moment I'd had. Just the empty, snow-covered road. It was like it had all been a dream. But I knew better. I drove on, the quiet of the night pressing in on me, the snow blurring the world around me. I had been prepared for an answer, but there was no answer, only more questions, more silence. The coins were still in my pocket, and even though I didn't want to look, I felt the urge to check them once more. They were there, cold to the touch, marked with those same strange years. The years I could never quite remember. By the time I reached the end of the road, I couldn't shake the sensation that the toll booth had followed me. Not physically, but in some other way. I could feel the chill of those coins on my fingers, the frost of the woman's presence lingering in the back of my mind. When I turned around to drive back, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the toll booth again. But there was nothing. Nothing but the endless, snowy road. I haven't been back to Vermont since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel the cold of the coins, the strange woman's gaze, and the memory of a toll booth that shouldn't have existed. And I know, deep down, that the past doesn't always stay where it belongs. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road, with nothing but the white of the snow ahead, be careful what you touch, what you accept. Be careful of things that don't belong to you. Some mistakes aren't just remembered, they're repeated. It started with the typewriter. I hadn't even unpacked when I noticed it. An old Olivetti, heavy, metal, its keys stiff and cold to the touch. I hadn't used a typewriter in years, but something about it pulled me in. Maybe it was the romantic idea of writing my novel the old way. I'd rented that cabin in Reykjavik to escape the noise of deadlines and editors breathing down my neck. The place was small. One room, slanted roof, window facing a narrow stretch of pine. No internet, barely a working phone line. It was supposed to be perfect for writing about isolation. I didn't realize how literal that would become. The first letter came 2 nights later. It was wedged under the door, the paper yellowed, the envelope soft at the edges, like it had been handled too much. My name wasn't on it. Instead, it read, "For the tenant of the north cabin." I figured it was some old mail misplaced by the post. Inside, there was only one line, typed in neat black ink. "Don't sit by the window after midnight." I laughed, thinking maybe it was a joke left by whoever stayed here last. But when I looked at the clock, it was already 12:07, and I was sitting exactly by the window. That stupid line stayed with me the entire night. I couldn't write. Every sound, the creak of wood, the wind pressing against the glass, felt louder. By dawn, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I shoved the letter into a drawer and tried to focus on my manuscript. I wrote maybe half a page before hearing a soft thunk at the door. Another envelope. This one was cleaner, newer. Inside was another typed message. "There's someone behind you when you write." I turned instantly, but of course there was no one. The cabin was so small you could see the entire place from the table. But still, I got up, checked every corner, even the tiny bathroom. Empty. My pulse wouldn't slow down. I went outside, took a walk, told myself maybe a local kid was playing a prank. By the third letter, I stopped pretending it was harmless. It appeared that evening, again under the door, as if slid from the inside. This time, the message said, "The last tenant didn't listen." I stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at something that feels wrong in your bones. Then I noticed something else, typed faintly at the bottom, like an old carbon copy imprint. Day 3, same time, same mistake. I started keeping notes after that. Every time I left the cabin, every sound, every flicker. I wasn't sleeping much. The typewriter began making faint clicking sounds even when I wasn't touching it. Once, I woke up at 3 a.m. and found a half-page of words typed out. My name, repeated over and over, perfectly aligned. I didn't even know if the ribbon still worked. I contacted the property owner, a man named Sigurd. He sounded half asleep when I called. "Ah, the North Cabin," he said. "You must be the journalist from London." I asked if anyone had stayed here recently. He hesitated, then said, "There was a teacher, quiet man, left suddenly last winter, didn't take his things." When I asked why, he said softly, he said the cabin didn't want him there. And then he hung up. That night I decided to test it. I sat by the window at 11:50 p.m., coffee in hand, notebook ready. The wind outside sounded like it was scraping the walls. At exactly midnight, the typewriter started typing. Slow, mechanical. Clack, clack, clack. I didn't move. I couldn't. When it stopped, I stood up and approached. The page said, "You should not have watched. I swear the keys moved by themselves." There was no draft, no vibration, no reason. I ripped the paper out and threw it into the stove. The flames caught fast, almost too fast, like the paper had been soaked in something. When it burned away, I saw black letters forming on the next blank sheet still in the roller. Fire doesn't help. That was the first time I thought about leaving. But by morning, something strange happened. Another envelope had appeared, but this one had my name on it. The letters were uneven, as if someone had tried to match my handwriting. The note read, "You will write this." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something pre-written. I started checking the mail slot, keeping watch by the door, even marking the floor with tape to see if anything shifted overnight. It didn't matter. The letters still came. Everyone described something that hadn't happened yet, but would hours later. One warned, "The phone will ring twice. Don't answer the second." That afternoon, the phone rang once, then again. I froze. Let it ring until it stopped. When I picked up after, there was a voice on the other end whispering, "Good." Then silence. I tried to tell a friend over the phone, my editor back in London, but I sounded insane even to myself. She laughed nervously, said I was probably stir-crazy. "Take a walk," she said. "You're in Iceland, not some haunted movie set." But when I stepped outside, I noticed footprints in the snow leading from the woods straight to my door. There was only one set, and they were fresh. On the 5th day, the letters began using my name. The one that morning read, "Mara, don't write what you read." I didn't understand it until I looked at my notes. Every strange thing that happened, the sounds, the messages, the typewriter, I'd been documenting it in my journal, exactly as it happened. When I compared the typewritten letters and my handwriting, I realized something terrifying. They mirrored each other. The letters were predicting what I was going to write, not the other way around. I tore out every page of my journal and threw them outside. The wind scattered them across the snow. But when I came back in, there was already another letter waiting. Now you've undone him too. That night, I couldn't stay still. I kept pacing, replaying every sound in my head. Around 1 a.m., the typewriter started again. I unplugged it. Still, it typed. The keys struck faster and faster until I yanked it off the desk. It hit the floor hard, ribbon unraveling like veins. The paper rolled out, covered in words I hadn't written. He watched through the glass. He wanted his story finished. The glass. The window. I turned slowly. Someone was standing outside in the snow. Not close, just far enough that I could see the outline of a coat, a hat, motionless. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I blinked, and he was gone. Only his footprints remained, circling the cabin, just like the ones I'd seen days ago. I packed that night, threw everything into my car, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. Dead. My breath fogged the windshield, and in that blur of condensation, I saw something written backward on the glass. Stay until he stops. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the door with a kitchen knife in my hand, listening. The cabin creaked, the wind howled, and at one point I heard a slow, dragging sound along the outside wall. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. By morning, there was another letter, this time nailed to the door from the inside. I hadn't heard a thing. The message said, "The story ends when you tell it." I didn't know what that meant until I realized I'd been recording every detail, mentally narrating, framing it in sentences, like it was already a story. Maybe that's what it wanted. To be told. I made one final call to Sigurd. He didn't answer, but someone else did. A woman, her voice faint, said, "He doesn't live here anymore. He left after his wife died in that cabin." My chest went cold. I asked when. She said, "Winter of '86, the exact year before I arrived." She was a journalist, too, the woman added softly, writing a novel about isolation. I left the cabin that afternoon, walked the 3 miles down the snowed-in road until I found a mechanic who towed my car. I didn't look back once. But when I unpacked in Reykjavik a few days later, my suitcase felt heavier than I remembered. Inside, under my clothes, was an envelope. Yellowed. Thin. It read, "For Mara, from the tenant before you." My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped it. I wanted to throw it into the fire. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, faint, smudged in places. I kept writing, too. I thought if I told it, it would stop. But the story keeps needing someone. Please stop before it finds another. I stared at that line for hours. The thought of someone else sitting in that same cabin, typing the same words, felt unbearable. I ripped the letter up and flushed the pieces, one by one. I thought that was the end. But last night I got home from work to find something slipped under my apartment door. New paper. Crisp. My name on the front. Inside. You shouldn't have. Told it. Which story setting scared you the most? Let me know in the comments. And that concludes our journey through Appalachia feral people horror stories. Which one made your blood run cold? If you made it all the way, type, "The hills are watching" in the comments, so I know you're one of the brave ones. Until next time, stay cautious, stay alert, and remember, some people are better left unseen